So anyway, today we want to talk about Abraham, and if we got the first slide there, yes, here is our father Abraham. It's an artist's conception of him, as probably as he looked about middle-aged. Look at him, Abraham, one of the central figures of the Bible, common ancestor to probably 20% of all the people on earth today. From the British Commonwealth nations, the United States of America, the world's Jewish population, and as well, he is the father, through his son Ishmael, of probably 400 million Arab people in the world today. Our ancestor, our common father, Abraham. The Bible first mentions Abraham in Genesis 11, where we learn of his father Terah, who lived in the 10th generation after the flood. But our real introduction to Abraham comes in Genesis 12, which I think is probably one of the most exciting chapters in the Bible. Abraham will be one of those rare individuals who will change the whole course of human history. Let's turn there to Genesis 12, and I want to read that, Genesis 12, 1-4. And we've read, this is a chapter, or verses that have been read many times over the years. Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham was destined to become a blessing to the whole earth for thousands of years after his life. Now, let's take a look at Sarai, his wife. You know, it's always said that behind every great man there's a great woman, okay? And here's an artist's conception of Sarai, whose life story, of course, is intertwined through the book of Genesis with that of Abraham. From what we can gather from Sarai, she was apparently a very well-respected and a powerful woman who also happened to be stunningly beautiful. I don't know if that photograph or if that artist's conception captures her true beauty. She was perhaps one of the most beautiful women in the ancient Middle East at that time. And we know that because later on in Genesis, we know that Abraham, when he had to go down to Egypt, him and Sarai, to escape the famine in Canaan, that they had to contrive a story about his relationship with her, so to keep her out of the Pharaoh's harem. He would love to have had Sarai as one of his harem ladies, but that was not to be. But we learn a lot about Abram's character and his struggles in the next 12 chapters of Genesis, beginning in chapter 12. When, of course, after that time, then the narrative shifts to that of his son Isaac, and then to his grandson Jacob, and so on. But what we want to do today is look not just at what the Bible says about Abraham, but also what some secular historical sources say about him. We're going to see that Abram, as he was called then before God changed his name, had unique talents and qualities that God would use to start and carry out his plan of salvation. So we know that after the flood and the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel, civilization spread out first from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. There we go. Well, excuse me. Okay, yeah. And here's an artist's conception of ancient Ur in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, where Abram supposedly was born and lived most of his early life. So Ur was a city already some 400 years old at the time of Abram, about 2100 BC. It was one of the first cities established after the flood. And what we see there is perhaps I think that's actually an artist's recreation of ancient ziggurat, or an ancient temple for moon worship and sun worship that was in the city of Ur. Ur was a pagan city. Ur was a very pagan city. Let's keep that in mind. So we can ask ourselves, what was Ur like? Ur was a pagan city. It worshipped dozens of different gods. Harper's Bible Dictionary says it was a city of moon worshipers. No doubt it was. It was influenced by Nimrod, the evil human who referred to in Genesis 10, 8-10. We won't read that. And then I got my notes mixed up. Oh, yeah, okay. Who founded in not only the tower, not only Babel, which of course became Babylon, but Iraq, Akkad, and Calneh, all in the land of Shinar. And I think we have a slide that shows that. So there's the ancient Fertile Crescent, and the green line that you see there shows the path, the probable path that Abram took from Ur, which is down in the lower right-hand corner, all the way up to Haran, and then down into the land of Canaan. It goes right through what the ancients call the Fertile Crescent. So we have some, I think we have some arrows that show some of these cities. There is ancient Iraq. You probably can't read it. It's kind of small there at the bottom. And then another one I think shows ancient Akkad. These were two of the cities that founded by Nimrod. Nimrod may have founded more cities. He probably was the founder of Ur itself. Unfortunately, this map does not show all of them, but we can get an idea here of the area that Abram was from. So Abraham, or Abram as he was called then, left Ur and went for a time to Haran, a city named after his brother. Remember that if we read in Genesis, I think it was 11, the last verse of that chapter that talks about Terah and his sons Abram and Haran. So Haran was probably, there it is up in the upper, above Babylon, up in the upper reaches of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It was named after his brother, and Genesis 12, verse 4, tells us that Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran and completed his move to Canaan, where except for a brief stay in Egypt, he would spend the rest of his life. Okay? So what do we know about Abram's earlier life, his life before God called him? We probably never think about that. Remember, Abram was not called as a child. Abram was called later on in life. One of the sources we have about Abram was the ancient historian Flavius Josephus. Now, I'm not going to read this book or any part of it. It's kind of dull and boring to read. Some of you may have this in your library. I've had this in my Bible library for several decades. This is a very Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century of the Roman Empire, was a Jewish priest and historian who had a remarkable life. But he wrote one of the more authoritative books on the histories of the Jewish people. But Flavius Josephus has this to say: Abram was a person of great sagacity or intellect, both for understanding all things and persuading his hearers, for which reason he began to have higher notions of virtue than others. Remember, the others around were all pagans. The priests were priests to the sun gods and the moon gods and so forth, all influenced by Nimrod. And he determined to change the opinion of all men concerning God. Now, here again, this is what Josephus is writing about Abram. He was the first to venture this notion that there was but one God, the creator of the universe. His opinion was derived from observations of the sun and moon. Maybe he started out as one of these ancient sun and moon priests, but he began to observe the movements of the sun and the moon and all heavenly bodies, and he concluded that if these bodies had power of their own, they would command their own regular motions. But since they do not have such power, they make it plain that they are subservient to him, that is God, who commands them, to whom alone we ought to justly offer our honor and thanksgiving. So let's let that sink in for a moment. Here was Abraham, or Abram as he was called at that time, realized that some tremendous power directed the motions of the sun and the moon and the planets. Now, he began to preach this. And you don't think that made him stand out in Ur? I think he stood out quite prominently. His fellow Chaldeans realized that Abram was unique. He was the first in his city to teach that there is only one true God. Let's think about that. Here's the ancient Chaldean Empire, 2,000 years before Christ. Thousands of people who were all pagans, who all believed, who all been influenced by Nimrod and the pagan priests that had risen up after him to believe in the sun gods and the moon gods, and each planet had a god. We still use some of those names for planets today, like Neptune and Saturn, right, don't we? Some things never change. But Abram realized that there was one true God, and he began to preach this. Now, I would say it's probably likely that Abraham and his wife Sarai came to fear living any longer in Ur. And this may be the reason why Abram and his family left. So no doubt about it, Abram was famous. And I want to read from what several other, just real briefly from what some other ancient historians say about Abram. The ancient Babylonian historian Berosus writes this of Abram without specifically naming him. In the 10th generation after the flood, and the Bible that corroborates with what Genesis says, in the 10th generation after the flood, there was among the Babylonians a man righteous and great and skillful in the celestial science. What do we call the celestial science today? Astronomy, right? Abram was an astronomer. He may have been one of the world's first, maybe the world's first astronomer. Nicholas of Damascus writes of Abram, Abram reigned at Damascus, being a foreigner. This was after he came up to the northern part of the area, who came with an army out of Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans. But after a long time, he removed from that country with his people to the land then called Canaan. So this guy says that he came with an army. Now, that could have referred to the fact that he just had a large entourage. As we'll see a few minutes later, we know that Abram's entourage, his hired hands, whatever slaves he had, servants, whatever, numbered several hundred people. So I'm going to turn to Genesis here, to Genesis 11:31. Excuse me, that's not in Josephus, that's in the Bible. Started turning into Josephus. Genesis 11:31, and read something more about Abraham. This is actually going back up before Genesis 12. Then Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife. And they went out with them to from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. And it says, so the days of Terah were 205 years. So we have to understand that it wasn't like Abram left Ur of the Chaldees, went to Haran, stayed there a few weeks, and then went on. He stayed there perhaps for decades in Haran, okay? He was 75. Abram was 75, not really considered old in those days, when he and Sarai and his nephew Lot left Haran and moved south into the land of Canaan, okay? Now, we don't know, the Bible doesn't say much about Abram's time in Haran, but we do know that he stayed there perhaps decades. He stayed there long enough to become a very, very wealthy man. I mean, in his time, he would have been the, Bill Gates, the Elon Musk of his day, possibly. He was a very, very wealthy man. And keep in mind, he was still married to one of the most beautiful women in the Middle East. So let's take a look at this map of Palestine, and I said we already have it up there, in Abram's time. We don't know much about this part of, as I said, of Abram's life, except that he became wealthy during his years in Haran. But God had greater things in store for Abram, and at age 75, God called him to move once again, and this time from Haran to Canaan to complete the greatest, most exciting part of his life. Not only the Bible, but other ancient sources attest to this. Ancient clay tablets unearthed at a location in northern Iraq called Mari, M-A-R-I, on the upper Euphrates, provide secular proof that Abram lived in Haran, accumulated wealth, and then he migrated there to Canaan. So perhaps maybe for the first 30, 40 years of Abram's life, he lived in Ur. Maybe the next 25 or 30 years of his life, he lived in Haran, accumulated wealth. And then at age 75, we know, because the Bible specifically says so, that at age 75, he moved south into Canaan. So the story of Abraham and his many exploits and trials provides some of the most exciting reading, I think, in all the Bible. But one aspect that's often overlooked about Abram's life is his remarkable rescue of his nephew Lot. Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis, sets up the account for us in Genesis 14, verses 1 to 4. So let's take a look at Genesis 14, verses 1 to 4. It came to pass, and I'm not going to try to read all these names correctly, but it came to pass in Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war And I'm not going to read all those names for sake of time. They made war on these 5 kings in the Sodom area where Abram lived. And all these joined together in the valley of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea, which we call the Dead Sea today. 12 years they had served, they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. So these kings rebelled against these 5 Assyrian kings during this time. And there was a battle, and which, Josephus describes it. We won't take time to go through that. But when the dust of that battle settled, Lot, Abram's nephew, had been taken captive. Now, we might think, hey, I've lost my nephew. Hopefully they'll take good care of him, but I can't know for sure. Abram wasn't content to do that. No, Abram was going to go and rescue him. He wasn't going to be content to let the Assyrians, these small Assyrian city-state kings, capture his nephew and other people from the Sodom area and keep them. So let's notice now Genesis 14. I'm going to drop down to verses 14 through 16, and we're going to read that, talk about it a little bit. Now when Abram heard that his brother, actually his brother's son, Lot, was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them at night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. Okay? I don't know if that map shows where Damascus would be, but Damascus, of course, today is still the capital of modern Syria. It would be up there about where we see Babylonia, up in that area, in the northern area up there. But Abram divided his forces by night and attacked those 5 Assyrian kings. Now, normal military strategy says you don't divide your forces, you weaken your forces, you concentrate your forces. But God had apparently given Abram some kind, perhaps in a vision, a plan by which he would attack and conquer these 5 Assyrian kings. God gave him the victory. And as I said, verse 14 says that Abram pursued them as far as Damascus. Now, the thing that's important about this is the distance. From where Abram lived down near Sodom, in that area, in southern Canaan, all the way up to Damascus, you can check this out yourself. It's more than 150 miles. And he did this with just 318 men. Abram, with 318 men, defeats these Assyrian kings with their armies. I'd say that was quite a miracle. So Josephus describes the battle, but as I said, for the sake of time, we won't read that as his account. But I would think we could assume and we could conclude that Abram was somewhat of a military genius as well. We know that he was appreciative of the victory because later on when he met Melchizedek, Prince of the Most High God, we'd think today that may have been Jesus Christ in the flesh at that time. He gave Melchizedek 1/10 of the spoils of that battle. So what can we conclude? What can we conclude? We tend to see Abram as a one-dimensional person, don't we, typically? We tend to see Abram as this white-haired patriarch who lives in his tent and spends most of his time in the tent waiting for the next word or the next vision from God. But I hope now that we can see Abram, or Abram, or Abraham as he was called later, in a much more complete way. Abram lived an exciting life. He was an influential person. He was a natural leader. He was famous and well known. And his wife Sarai was also well known. I wish we knew more. I wish the Bible had given more information about Sarai. But he was also, we know that in addition to being an astronomer, one of the first to learn the fact that there was one God, not all the many gods the Babylonians believed in, that Abram was he was a wealthy person. Certainly he would be considered today maybe a famous cattle and sheep rancher, and he was also a military genius who outmaneuvered 5 kings with 318 men. But most importantly, Abraham learned about God. He came to know God very well, and he became what we know as the father of the faithful. God raised up nations and companies of nations and hundreds of millions of people through him. Those nations today exist through the promises made to Abraham some 4,000 years ago.